I'm the president of an organization called the Foundation for Middle East Peace, which for the last 32 years has been promoting peace between Israel and the Arab states, and for many years, a two-state outcome to this historic struggle. My foundation is an educational advocacy organization. We support other like-minded groups like J Street, Americans for Peace Now, and many others. We publish, and we are very pleased to see the enormous outpouring of support and participation in this J Street Forum. I've come to all of these from the beginning, and surely this is the biggest and thus far the most exciting. The subject today is Israel politics following the 2013 elections, more than meets the eye. Now that cryptic title could lead in many directions. We have a great panel that's going to discuss it. And I know all of you have many questions, and you can raise them at the end of the forum when Dalia will open up the Q&A session. The process of change in Israeli politics, which would lead to peace with the Palestinians, and Palestinian politics as well, is a political process. And in the end, it will rely on the votes of the Israeli public and the Palestinian public. No one else is going to make peace for the Israelis and Palestinians, and surely they're not going to impose it. But there is a role for foreign support, foreign criticism, and so one of the things I hope some of our panelists will talk about is the intersection between American politics, American policy, and the policies of the parties and the policies of the American Jewish community. Very, very critical factor in my view. There is, I have to concede, some despair in this country because of the length of this terrible conflict, the failure of past diplomacy, the vast settler occupation enterprise that has gone on now for some 40 years. Is it too late? I don't think it's too late. And I think many people who follow this still think there is a good prospect for peace if people begin to take it more seriously. Is the Israeli political process going to undertake a real transformation which would mobilize a majority of the Israeli public for peace? This is would result in a major internal change in Israel, because this process of no peace and occupation and settlement has gone on for so long. So the panel will no doubt talk about that. There are new political parties in Israel. There is a new and more vibrant secular, non-ideological voice. Thus far, it has not been especially heard in this country for its opposition to occupation and settlement. So we're in for an interesting panel, and at the end, of course, you'll have time to ask some questions. So Yael will introduce our panelists.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Ambassador Wilcox. My name is Yael Patir, and I'm the director of J Street's Israel program. We established our office in Israel almost a year and a half ago, almost between a year and a half and 2 years. It is in Tel Aviv, and I'm very happy to be leading it from its first day. Just a note to the audience that we are being live streamed, so this panel is broadcasted, and whatever you say is on record, so be warned. It's great to see a full room this morning. We're going to, when we've put this panel together, we really, we knew that there's a lot of questions that came up after the results of the elections. the composition of the 19th Knesset came as a surprise. We have new parties. We have 48 new comers, new members of Knesset, which is a historical number. We have more women in this Knesset. We have more religious members of Knesset. And we have a very interesting coalition, which until now we're not really sure where it's taking us, because it's a coalition that is combined from parties that have different, sometimes conflicting agendas. So the results of the election, as I said, were very surprising. And I think we're still navigating in this new water of Israeli politics. There was an expectation before the election that they would be different than previous elections, mainly because of the social protest. There was a lot of efforts made to get people out to vote. The parties were directing their campaigns to young audience. Eventually, the percentage of vote, the turnout was about 68%. And the two parties that were really targeting young people, which is Yair Lapid's party, Yesh Atid, and Naftali Bennett's party, Abait HaYehudi, were the big winners of these elections, and they're both the brothers that are sitting in the coalition, thanks to each other. What we're going to do this morning with our distinguished guests, speakers, experts, is that we're going to look at this reality. We're going to look at the political landscape in Israel and talk about what it means to the peace process and what it means for Israeli internal and external policies. I'll present our speakers, and then we'll have more of a facilitated discussion. I will give them 5 minutes of opening remarks. Then we'll do some questions and answers on the stage, and then we'll open it to the audience. You have a microphone in the middle of the room, and I'll just ask you when I give the sign to cue in the microphone for your questions. So, our speakers. We're very delighted to have this morning member of Knesset, Yitzhak Vaknin, from Shas party. He was born in 1958 in Israel, and he has been a member of Knesset since 1996. He sat on many committees in the Knesset, and he served in two governments as deputy minister. You have his full bio in your programs. I'm not going to read his whole bio, but you're welcome to have a look. And most importantly, he's married and has 5 children. Barak Ravid, who some of you probably know his face from the Haaretz website, is a diplomatic correspondent for Haaretz newspaper. He joined Haaretz in April 2007, covering Prime Minister's office and Foreign Ministry and Ministry of Defense, dealing with issues such as U.S.-Israel relations, EU-Israeli relations, and the Middle East peace process, and giving us recently some of the best scoops that we read. He's a must-read if you're into this kind of stuff. Dalia Shindlin is an international political and strategic consultant whose expertise in public opinion research. She is also an academic and a writer, and a good source of wisdom for J Street and for our different delegations when they come to Israel. She also, she's one of the leading writers for 972 magazine, which I'm sure many of you read and use also as a resource, a more in-depth resource for issues of the conflict. We will open the session this morning with Dalia. What I'll do is that I'll present an opening question for each of our speakers, and I will ask you to talk for 5 minutes, and I will be very tough on time. My question to Dalia. You've been polling Israelis for over a decade now. This cycle brought into Knesset, as I said, 48 new members, 2 or 3 new parties, and a combined list like Likud Beitenu, who, by the way, lost many seats, about 11 seats in this round. Eventually, we have a coalition that does not include the ultra-Orthodox, and after many years that they've sat in all the coalition, are we really seeing a fundamental change in Israeli politics? Is it more of the same?
Thank you, Yael, and thank you for everybody for coming here so early in the morning. I will do my best to stick to 5 minutes. It's going to be tough. And also I'm going to be focusing, of course, on domestic politics. We have to remember that there is a very important external context here, but I will leave that to my colleague because he's going to be better at it. Do these elections reflect real change? I want to break it down into, does it reflect change in the leadership, and does it reflect change among the public? And certainly there was a sense of re-engagement. Okay, we had higher turnout, as you pointed out, and new Knesset members. But at the political level, I would argue that the idea of all these new people isn't really that new for Israeli politics. Every election cycle for the last decade, I would say, the Israeli parties during the campaign rush to bring in new people, celebrities. We call it a sort of beauty contest where they try to, each party sort of competes for new people in its list and party revitalization, a new kind of merits, a new kind of labor. So that's not so new. It's true that turnout was higher, but only by a few points, and it didn't even come near the average of 80% turnout that we saw in the first 50 years of Israeli elections. And now, if we think about, are things new on the issue that we're most concerned with here, the peace process? If you look at the top 4 parties, okay, who won the elections, the highest polling parties, Likud Beitenu and Naftali Bennett's party, Bayit HaYehudi, got 43 seats together, and they won because, a poll just before the elections showed that people saw them as stronger, primarily on what we call political, diplomatic, conflict-related issues. We call it Medini. And Netanyahu and Bennett were seen as stronger on those issues than on anything related to social and economic issues. Whereas the other 2 parties, Labor and Yesh Atid, totaling 34 seats, their leaders, Yair Lapid and Shelly Yachimovich, were seen as stronger on social economic issues. So among the top 2 parties, they won because of their positions on the conflict, which reflect continuity. And the other thing is, another poll just before the elections asked what people's top priority was when they were going to the polls. 43% chose social economic issues, only 16% chose peace and conflict related to the Palestinians. In other words, what was driving the change here were people's concerns with social economic issues. It shouldn't be a surprise coming out of a major wave of social protests, but it wasn't a demand for change with relation to the conflict. And there are another couple of points that show this continuity. First of all, the coalition that was formed is largely against actually, a change in terms of the conflict. The 2 parties that have really made moving ahead on a 2-state solution and negotiations the center of their platform, Yesh Atid and Hatnuah are just a small portion, about a third of the coalition. And even among them, Yair Lapid has been pretty ambiguous about his actual position. Okay, they claim rhetorically that they're for a 2-state solution, but he's made many statements about never dividing Jerusalem, never compromising on anything to do with right of return, and he's spoken in Ariel. These are not statements that says that he's truly committed to making the change, even if in theory he supports it. So where do we stand with relation to the public? Has there been a change among the public in attitudes towards moving ahead on negotiations and the conflict? Well, for one thing, look at the parties people supported. Okay, even if they're not in government, 7 different parties theoretically in their platforms rhetorically support a 2-state solution. That's 83 members of Knesset, 64% of the Knesset, who theoretically supports a 2-state solution, and that's not including Shas. Okay, because Shas in the past we have to consider could potentially support negotiations as a solution, a resolution or an agreement, as they did in the Oslo years. Polls repeatedly show that Israelis are committed to peace negotiations. 62%, 65%, 2/3, very consistent for about a decade of Israelis expressing commitment to the negotiations process and to a 2-state solution, okay, even in the most recent polls. So in that sense, if the government were to reach an agreement and put it before the people, I don't want to predict what would happen in a referendum campaign, but it's pretty likely that they would support it. Okay, I don't expect the people to be the obstacle here. But that has to be tempered with the fact that there's extremely low confidence in the process. Okay, according to the most recent polls, 70% of Israelis don't think the current process will lead to an actual deal. And the other thing is that they still don't feel genuine urgency. Okay, even after probably the most dramatic thing that happened in terms of external pressure, which was the new EU guidelines about funding institutions across the West in the West Bank, there was a moment of urgency, but Israelis, it hasn't completely sunk in, and for the most part, many Israelis really still feel that the status quo exists and can be continued. Okay, so to summarize, the Israeli public attitude towards the peace process hasn't really changed, and that attitude can be characterized as people will accept peace, but they're not demanding it. They're not going to go out on the streets and demand it. And those attitudes are reflected by the parties they voted for. However, if those parties, if the leadership, if Prime Minister Netanyahu were to get behind an agreement and go to the people and ask them to support it, I have pretty little doubt, I always hedge my bets in Middle East politics, but I have pretty little doubt that they would probably support it. Okay? But given that the government itself reflects a level of continuity that I argued before, there's a sort of cycle of continuing the status quo. The people aren't demanding it, the government isn't really pushing for continuity, and so how do you break this cycle of continuing the status quo? Okay, if there's more continuity than actual change. And this, I'm going to end here. Yeah, I'm going to end here because I hope this opens up the conversation. I think there are two major reasons why leaders do things that are uncomfortable when it comes to conflict resolution: negative incentive and positive incentive. Okay, we call them carrots and sticks. The sticks are punishment, various forms of sanctions and diplomatic isolation. I think that any real punishment is pretty unlikely to go as far as it would have to go to actually hurt Israel. And I think it's also likely to backfire. In other words, I wouldn't count on the sticks being the reason for Israel to move. And in terms of incentive, I want to break it down into a few categories, and we can think about how that might advance. One is external. Can there be external incentive from the rest of the world? And I'll leave that aside for now because it's hard to think of them. I mean, Israel is in most of the clubs it needs to be in and enjoys, widespread economic and diplomatic relations with other countries. But maybe there are other external incentives. The other two kinds of incentives are internal, political, and I consider that the possibilities for what the parties could do. Okay, there are alternate coalition formations that could happen. There are scenarios where there could be a different coalition in which, we have to remember labor primaries are coming up. There might be a new head of labor, there might not, but labor might decide to go into a coalition, could replace Bennett's party, which is considered more of an obstacle to a two-state solution. Likud could split, you never know. There are other political considerations, and the other major internal incentive is electoral. Okay, if leaders are convinced that people would vote based on the conflict again, based on the issue of moving ahead on conflict negotiations, but not just negotiations, actually resolution, that could be incentive for them to follow where they see public opinion going. And we have seen over the last few months a number of regular polls showing strengthening of the center-left bloc if elections were to be held today. So there are reasons to consider these are not so much about change, these recent elections, but there is hope for change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dalia. Can you hear me? I'll go to the podium. Indeed, I think exactly what you're describing is showcased in the street, let's say in Israel. The peace process has started. Everything is relatively quiet on both sides, on the opposing and the supporting side. To Barak, so we have a coalition. Half its members are against the peace process, sitting in the coalition that is in the government that is currently part of this peace process, and at the same time we see this relative quiet, both I think in the political arena and in the street. Maybe you think differently. So what should we really expect from this coalition as the process develops?
We have in Israel a right-wing government. Okay, I would even say that we have in Israel an extreme right-wing government. Okay, such a government that hasn't ruled Israel for a very long time. When you have a central party of the coalition, Bayit Yehudi, the Jewish Home, which is a one-state solution, a party, or even some would call it the apartheid party, okay? And they're sitting in the government in very central roles, holding to very central ministries like the Ministry of Construction, which deals with building in the settlements. So that's the bad news. After saying all those bad news, you might ask what the good news are. But there are good news. The good news are that, and here I don't agree with you that there's relative quiet, political quiet, because in the last few weeks, since the peace talks started, since July 29th, when they were inaugurated here in Washington, there's no quiet in the right-wing bloc of the coalition. Actually, when you wake up in the morning every day or every other day, you hear about another letter signed by right-wing MKs from the coalition, from the Prime Minister's party, from the Likud, urging against a two-state solution, against negotiations, against the release of prisoners, against every other day you hear another letter or another initiative. You know, just I think just last night, while Prime Minister Netanyahu was flying out of Israel for the meeting with President Obama and for his speech at the United Nations General Assembly, I think that 4 or 5 members of his cabinet and many MKs were holding a conference in Jerusalem, calling the Prime Minister to not to make any progress in the two-state solution. So something in the coalition or something that is going on, I don't know why they feel that, but for some reason they are afraid. They are afraid that they're sitting in the government, and they're sitting in a government that is working against their platforms, that is promoting two-state solution. So I think that, as I said, there are good news and bad news. But when you look at the Israeli coalition, and I think this is true for any Israeli government in matters of national security and matters of peace and war, is the Israeli system, although it's a very different system than here, it's a parliamentary system and a coalition system, even so, on matters of peace and war, the Israeli Prime Minister is a de facto president. Okay, he calls the shots. And this is why we talk a lot about the coalition, whether the coalition will let Bibi do this, will let Bibi do that. In my opinion, this is not the story. The story is Benjamin Netanyahu. Okay, what goes through his mind, what he wants to do in the next, I don't know, year, 2 years, 3 years, how he wants to be remembered in history, and what's the legacy he wants to leave behind him. And unfortunately, you know, until now, I can't say that I know the answer for this question. I can't really say that I know for a fact that when Benjamin Netanyahu entered those peace talks, just not going to be a two-state solution, there will be a one-state solution, and then it will be the end of the Zionist enterprise. It did take him a few years to get that, but finally he did, and you know, it's a step in the right direction. But and by the way, this is one of the reasons that the right wing in Israel is so terrified, because all of a sudden they're hearing the prime minister who used to stand on the you know, on every stage and say that he's against the Palestinian state, that time is on our side and things like that, and all of a sudden he's speaking about a two-state solution. And the fact that binational state will be a disaster and a catastrophe and things like that. You know, I spoke to Danny Dayan, the former head of the Settler Council, and he told me, why are you so terrified? Why? I mean, nothing is happening. I mean, Tzipi Livni is talking to Sai Barakat. Okay, so what? We've been doing this for the last 20 years. What is making you so nervous? And he told me, listen to Bibi. He starts speaking like a lefty. and this is one of the reasons that they feel nervous. And you know what? If they're nervous, I'm completely okay with it. But as I said, I think we will have to look in the next few months where Bibi is going, because and whatever Bibi wants to do, he's able to do it politically. I don't think that it was the same thing in the last term. Benjamin Netanyahu likes to say to everybody that he has, coalition problems. He can't do this, he can't do that because of the right, because of this party or that party. Benjamin Netanyahu today does not have any political problem to promote a two-state solution. He has every party in the opposition will support him. And even inside Likud, although there are many very vocal oppositionists, when push comes to shove, the leather chairs in the cabinet room are much too comfortable to leave for the fact that you're opposing the two-state solution. So I think that at the end of the day, I'll finish my remarks by saying that at the end of the day, I think that there is a chance to see in the next year or so some progress. The question will be whether Bibi decides to do it. If he decides to do it, it will happen. If he decides not to, it will not.
Thank you. I like this tradition of good news and bad news that we've created, and I hope that member of Knesset Vaknin will follow. Tov ורע, אופטימי ופסימי. Member of Knesset Vaknin, you probably, from all of the people in the room, are best familiar with our Prime Minister. You've sat with him in the Knesset for 20 years in a few governments. My question to you is really about Shas. Shas has been in the coalition since the early 90s. It supported the Oslo process, but then in the late 90s and early 2000, there was a leadership that took Shas more to the right, and we've heard statements against the peace process. Now that Shas is sitting in the opposition, are we expected to see Shas being one of the leading powers to push for the peace process?
אני רוצה, בוקר טוב לכולם, good morning. להגיד לברק שלא יהיה מודאג בכלל. אני אתן איזה תזכורת לפוליטיקה הישראלית, מכיוון שאני כבר כ-18 שנים מכהן בכנסת, והייתי בממשלה של ברק וגם בממשלה של שרון.
Good morning. I want to tell Barak not to worry. I've been in many governments before, in Ehud Barak's government and in Sharon's government.
בשנת 2001 הייתה ממשלת שרון ללא חרדים. כל הימין היה בפנים. כל הימין, בסיטואציה של היום בדיוק. אנחנו היינו בחוץ, אני הייתי חבר כנסת. בממשלה הראשונה של שרון הייתי חבר כנסת. בשנייה כבר לא היינו בתוך הממשלה. ואני חושב שמי ששמע את שרון בנאומים שלו, הוא אמר דין נצרים כדין תל אביב.
In 2001, when in the first Sharon government, it was a government without Haredim. Everyone in the government was right-wing. We sat outside. It was a situation just like we have right now. And if anyone who heard Sharon at that time would have heard him say that the rules of Nitzarim, which is a settlement, is the same as the rules for Tel Aviv.
וקיבלנו פינוי של חבל ארץ, אפילו בלי פיסת נייר. זה נעשה ככה, ראש הממשלה החליט, התפרק הליכוד אחרי כן, מי שזוכר. והיום אני יכול להגיד לכם, תהיו אופטימיים. דווקא ממשלת ימין תעשה מה שאף אחד לא יעשה.
So at that time, we got an evacuation of a piece of land without even a piece of paper. And now I tell you all to be optimistic, especially specifically with a right-wing government.
אני אומר יותר מזה. אומרים שהשדולה פה של הג'יי סטריט זה שדולה שמאלנית. אז אני אומר לכם, אני לא מאמין לא בשמאל, יעזבו מהר את הכיסאות.
Okay. More than that, I want to say that this lobby, J Street, they say that this is a left-wing lobby, but there's no right or left in Israel today. The reality is much more important. Rabin once said to me before I was an MK, he said, "We spoke, but you gave back land," referring to the right wing, that they gave back land. That's why there's no right or left today. It's just a matter of demagoguery. But the Prime Minister will do whatever he wants. Bibi doesn't have to be afraid of Bennett because in 2005, the Bayit HaYehudi party stayed in the coalition until the very last minute. What Barak said about wanting to save your seat is very true.
לגבי המפלגה שלי, אני חושב שאם אני מזכיר פה את הרב עובדיה, שאני מאחל לו שיהיה לו רפואה שלמה ובריאות, תמיד אמר שהוא בעד תהליך של שלום, שלום אמיתי, שלום שיש בו ביטחון למדינת ישראל. אמר את הדברים בצורה ברורה, לא מהיום, כבר הרבה שנים. דעתי האישית שלי וגם של חלק מהמפלגה שלי, שצריך להיות הסדר. הרי אנחנו צריכים להגיד את האמת. אם אנחנו רוצים לשלוט על עוד 5 מיליון פלסטינים, גם בעזה, אמנם יצאנו משם, וגם ביהודה ושומרון, אז בוא ניתן להם אזרחות ישראלית ונגמור את העסק. או לא, צריך להגיד משהו, מה אנחנו רוצים. או אנחנו שולטים עליהם ונותנים להם את כל הזכויות כאזרחים, או לא, או שביבי יבין את זה מזמן. רק ביבי פחד בקדנציה הקודמת לבוא לכנסת ולהגיד, חבר'ה, 2 מדינות לשני עמים. מה הוא עשה? הלך לאוניברסיטה, שם אף אחד לא יפריע לו בנאום. בטח לא הליכוד שלו. אנחנו לא נפריע לו בנאום שלו. ולכן אני חושב שהמציאות מחייבת אותנו לעשות דברים היום, שמה שלא נעשה היום יהיה יותר קשה לעשות אותו מחר. ולכן אני בין אלה שאומר כבר שנים, צריך להתקדם לתהליך. ככל שהתהליך הזה ייגמר יותר מהר, ייטב. ולא, רבותיי, יש לי דעות גם לגבי כל האביב הערבי והמזרח התיכון, לגבי מה שקורה בו.
I want to speak about my party. Rav Ovadia Yosef, who should have a speedy recovery, always used to say that he supported peace. My personal opinion, and the opinion of a number of members of my party, is that if we want to rule over 5 million Palestinians, then we have to give them citizenship. If we don't want to give them citizenship, then we have to figure out a resolution to the conflict with them. Bibi's understood this a long time ago, but he was afraid in the last in his last prime ministership. We need to move forward immediately to a resolution to the conflict and do everything we can.
עוד דבר אחד שאני רוצה להגיד. רבותיי, הטעות, אני לא אומר שאני בא ממקום שאולי חוויתי את מלחמת ההתשה הכי הרבה, יותר מכל אזרח אחר כמעט, אני אומר מחברי הכנסת שנמצאים בכנסת. אני גר על גבול לבנון, ובמושב יערה שבגליל המערבי, ואני יכול להגיד שתקופה לא פשוטה לחיות עם טילים של החיזבאללה, טילים של אש"ף בתקופות, עוד שהייתי ילד, גדלתי ונולדתי באזור, לא פשוט. אבל אני חושב שהיו תקופות שקטות, והיו תקופות שאני ראיתי לאן זה הולך. אמרתי את זה מראש בכנסת, אנשים גיחכו ואמרו לי, אתה אולי הוזה את הדברים, אני לא הוזה. רבותיי, צריך לחיות את המציאות. המזרח התיכון הוא חבית חומר נפץ, שיכולה להתפוצץ כל רגע. אנחנו רואים מה קורה בסוריה, ורואים מה קורה במצרים, ורואים מה קורה בתוניס, ומה קורה במקומות אחרים. המציאות הזאת, רבותיי, שמי שחשב שיש פה איזה אביב ערבי, טועה טעות חמורה. זה לא אביב ערבי, רבותיי. אל-קאעידה תופס מקום בכל נקודה במזרח התיכון. ועדיף לנו המשטרים הקודמים, אם אתם שואלים אותי, ואני אומר פה בארצות הברית, שיש פה שאלה, אם ארצות הברית צריכה להתערב בסוריה, לא צריכה להתערב בסוריה. מי יתפוס את המקום שם? למרות המצב הקשה שהשתמשו בנשק כימי, רבותיי, אם אל-קאעידה יתפוס שם את השלטון, הוא יעשה יותר גרוע מה שאסד עושה. כי שם אין דין ואין דיין. רבותיי, המציאות לא פשוטה. לכן חובה עלינו להגיע להסדרים עם הפלסטינים כמה שיותר מוקדם. תודה.
Okay, I come from a place where I experienced in my own life an ongoing war, probably more than anyone else in Knesset. I live on the Lebanon border. There were rockets from Hezbollah and others. It's not easy to live there, but at times. But I've always said this in the past: the Middle East is a dangerous place and could explode at any moment. Whoever thought that this was an Arab Spring was wrong. We should prefer the old government over the new. There's Al-Qaeda everywhere. We need to keep things going. If you ask me about the U.S. Support in Syria, I think the U.S. should intervene in Syria despite the chemical weapons and the Yeah, I apologize. It's very hard to do this. Should not intervene in Syria. The reality isn't easy, and despite all of these threats around, Israel needs to pursue a resolution with the Palestinians as soon as possible.
Thank you very much, Member of Knesset, and thank you, Sarah, for the translation. We know it's not easy.
הפעם אותו דבר. זאת אומרת, אם ילכו לתהליך, לראש הממשלה אין לו בעיה בתהליך הזה. חד וחלק.
Okay, as we saw in 2005 with the disengagement plan, even then the Bayit HaYehudi party, number of members of Knesset left and Labor Party went in and took over those spots. The same thing will happen here if Bibi Netanyahu will decide to move forward with a peace agreement.
Please.
I'm Yael Radin from Washington, D.C. Whether it's the U.S. or Israel or any other democracy, I'm always skeptical about people talking about the public. And it just happened that I was in Israel soon after the election and spoke to a number of people who were surprised at the results of the election. So there was something that was going on. And this is really a question for Dalia. Does your polling, can we disaggregate some of the data in your polling? And what can we say about voting by age, by gender, by community? Because I think, that we know something is happening, but we don't really know exactly the issues that are really at play. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's take two more questions, and thank you.
Hi. Paul Sham, also from Washington, D.C. I have a general question and a specific one for Knesset Vaknin. The general one is none of you mentioned Iran and how it might play. And it's interesting that in Haaretz today, as I'm sure you've seen, suddenly Israel is an ally of Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and the Egyptians, again, worried about American approaches to Iran. How do you think this may have a effect on the public, given the agitation against Iran? For Chaver Knesset Vaknin, how you gave a very positive and optimistic view from our point of view. But there has been at times, especially in the 90s, something of a disconnect between the rank and file of Shas and the leadership, especially when Aryeh Deri has been influential in the 90s and now. Do you see Shas, if the government breaks and reforms, continuing its closeness to the left, to merit, and being willing to take the heat of a peace policy of a new government? Can your rank and file accept that?
Okay, one last question.
Yes, I'm Gil Kulik from New York City. If I heard correctly, there's a difference of opinion between Chaver Knesset Vaknin and Barak Ravid on the question of whether the current coalition would stay together in the event that there was a real serious prospect of an agreement. My feeling has always been that we'll know that Bibi's serious when he's prepared to see Beit HaYehudi and half of the Likud leave and be replaced by parties on the left. If I understood Barak correctly, you seem to think that this current coalition could stay together all the way through to the end. It's frankly rather hard for me to imagine that Naftali Bennett is going to stay in his position or continue to be a member of the coalition if there's a real agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And I want to sort of clarify whether that's really your belief or whether you share Chaver Knesset Vaknin's view that there'll have to be a change in the coalition at the point at which an agreement looks to be reality.
Thank you. We will start with Dalia.
Yeah. Thanks for your question about the analysis of different communities in Israel about the elections. I mean, what I can tell you pretty much is the trends that we've seen have been pretty consistent for the last few years. So I would say maybe 5 years now we're seeing pretty consistent trends in terms of how these different groups think. So the clearest such trend is young people versus older people. In other words, the middle-aged people between like 35 and 55, break down like the general population. But, the older people in Israel, 55 and above, are the ones who are most likely to lean towards left-wing parties like Labor and Meretz. Their core groups, their core supporters come from people over 55. Okay, when you look at the community, at the group of people between 18 and 35, 2/3 of them identify themselves as right-wing and probably vote for right-wing or religious parties. So, we'll have to decide how to describe Shas. But that's partly because of demographics, okay? The religious community in Israel has more children. Greater portion of the younger population is religious people, and they are either going to vote for a religious party or a right-wing party or a religious and right-wing party. In terms of gender, this has not changed that much over the last few decades. There is not a major difference in voting by gender. There are only slight differences between men and women when it comes to attitudes towards the peace process. I know this may sound surprising for some people because, you might have expected there would be, but there just isn't. There is sometimes slightly higher support from women for women candidates, but not always. And I think the major thing that we saw going on in these last elections.
Interested in hearing what you think the Israeli perspective is on that.
Hi, Donald Gardner from New York. Dalia, to you. You mentioned status quo and I think a lack of a sense of urgency in the public. So the question is, has the public seen this map, which when we saw it last year in Israel, we were stunned at the Swiss cheese aspect of the West Bank? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Carrie Gardner from the great state of New York, Westchester region. So when we first started hanging out with all these UJ Street folk 4 years ago, I seem to recall that the word occupation was still a red word, and I believe I heard, Barak, that you said that Netanyahu's even saying we have to end the occupation. So is that like no longer a red word? Can I go to Tel Aviv or Ariel and say occupied territory?
Thank you. First of all, I think it's very impressive, Barak, that you're able to tweet while you're on the panel.
And they said,
And I appreciate you retweeting my tweets. My question is, my name is Aaron Magid. I'm a graduate student at Harvard, and I also write a little for Open Zion, among other publications. My question for Dalia, she said the center-left bloc is growing, but the reports I've seen is Yesh Atid is dropping considerably, including mainly by Yair Lapid's performance, and it doesn't seem like Tzipi Livni is gaining much traction. So how are you seeing such a major increase among the center-left?
Haaretz and labor.
Thank you.
If we have one more.
Hi, my name's Maya Paley. I'm from Los Angeles, and I'm with the Right Now Coalition. I am wondering about this new government, how they're going to deal with the African asylum seekers in Israel. That's an issue that hasn't really been touched on. And Eli Yishai, who's a member of your party, to the member of Knesset, has said that his main objective is to rid them of the country, to get them out of the country. Is there going to be a change from your party on this issue? Thank you.
Okay, it's dangerous to tell me we have little time left because I'll just start to speak very fast, which is my natural tendency anyway. In terms of, do Israelis perceive that the cost of the conflict is placing a burden on their daily lives? I mean, I have to say, you know, it's the most logical argument to make, and many people ask me this all the time who are, you know, from abroad, from outsiders. And when the social protest started, I think many of us, you know, who identify with the, you know, the urgency of moving ahead towards resolution of the conflict expected that this would be a natural part of the social protest. We are suffering economically because we have this economic burden of the conflict in many different ways. It's not just how much of the budget goes into defense, you know, many aspects of it. But in fact, the social protest very consciously, almost self-consciously, refused to make that connection. The leaders of the social protest insisted that the connection not be made, arguing with people who wanted to make the connection between the two, that this was not part of the message they wanted to convey. And I don't have any good explanation for that. I was, you know, surprised and frustrated by it. But I can tell you that on a daily basis, you know, the average Israeli doesn't sort of feel it, and they're in a kind of unconscious, I don't know, sort of denial, a sort of denial. I mean, they may sort of rationally know that there are, you know, that there are incredible costs going into it, but when they think about the hardship of their daily life and why their salaries aren't big enough to cover their rent, they don't think about the occupation, not in the terms of the word occupation and not in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What they think of is no partner. That's what they think of. And if you ask them, that's what they'll say. Sure, it's a burden, but there's no partner. And you know, that's like really a major contributing force to the sense of ongoing, you know, status quo / apathy. Do Israelis know about the map? Not really, actually. Most Israelis, if you ask them, don't cross the Green Line, don't go into the West Bank, at least not that they know of. Okay, you know what I mean? They cross the Green Line, but they don't realize it. They don't consciously go into settlements. They don't really, I'm talking about people inside the Green Line. And so, I mean, I've done focus groups, especially with center-left types, who say, why would I go there? It's like another country. You know, so not going as a political statement because we're on the left or, you know, the center-left also means not knowing. Okay, and that's, you know, the mainstream, the center and the center-left, and you know, the right is a different story because they're much more connected to it. But the right isn't bothered by that map, obviously. So the term occupation, I will say that this really, there is a left and a right in Israel. I mean, I want to think that Israelis are inherently pragmatic when it comes to a solution, but there are different attitudes. And among the left, everybody can talk about the occupation, but among certainly the settler right, if you say the word occupation, they say, what are you talking about? You know, this is not an occupation. So this is a debate. It's a term constantly used. I mean, we've had leaders who've used it, but I actually think that there's more resistance to it now from the settlers, certainly, and from portions of the right than maybe there was during the Oslo years. I answered the question about polls. Different polls show different things. The polls I was referring to were in June. Since then, Yair Lapid certainly has taken a bigger hit. I recently read that he ranked first in people's greatest level of disappointment in new politicians, but that's also quite natural for these protest parties. As I mentioned, there's not so much of a there. Every election cycle for the last decade, we've had a party that has gotten a surprising number of votes. Okay, not 19, but 6, 7, 10, because people are annoyed with the old parties, and often by the next election cycle, they're back down to 2 or 3 and then don't cross the threshold the following election. So I don't think that's necessarily Yair Lapid's fate, but it's not surprising that he's had a dip after the euphoria. In terms of the African asylum seekers, that's I can probably defer to you because I think the question was directed at you. But I will say that this is obviously exposing enormous rifts in the public and the leadership's perception of what kind of society we want to be. Do we want to be a society who places the highest priority on a very narrowly defined sense of Jewish character, or do we want to be a society that welcomes the downtrodden? Okay, and I think that's the tension that it's exposed in very, I would say, sort of vicious ways, and in terms of the language and rhetoric coming from the leadership.
קצר. אני אענה גם על זה. לגבי השאלה אם הסכסוך משפיע על העניין החברתי-כלכלי במדינת ישראל, אין ספק שההוצאה לביטחון במדינת ישראל היא הוצאה גדולה מאוד. כמעט כרבע מהתקציב הולך, 20%, 50% מהתקציב הולך לביטחון. הוצאה לא פשוטה, ולכן זה משפיע, אבל אין ספק שהממשלה הזאת, הנוכחית, גזרה גזרות קשות על הציבור הישראלי, שהוא לא יכול לעמוד בהם. קשה מאוד היום במדינת ישראל, אני אומר את זה הרבה זמן, אני פעיל חברתי מאוד חזק. אמרתי את זה לראש הממשלה כבר בממשלה הקודמת לגבי נושא הבינוי, צעירים במדינת ישראל היום, לא יכולים לקנות בית, אין אפשרות רבותיי, קשה מאוד, גם הסחירות יקרה מאוד, גם מי שחי בסחירות, לכן המצב הוא לא פשוט, הממשלה הנוכחית הוסיפה גזרות קשות על משפחות ברוכות ילדים, קיצצה בקצבאות הילדים, שאני חושב שזה טעות פטאלית, מי שמבין מה זה משפחה שקשה לה לסיים את החודש, הדבר הזה לא פשוט, ולכן אני חושב שמה שאמר לפחות יאיר לפיד, אנחנו רואים שינוי בין מה שהוא הבטיח לבוחרים, כי במדינת ישראל המזל הגדול שהקדוש ברוך הוא נתן לנו את השכחה, שאנחנו שוכחים מהר, הזיכרון קצר. הוא אמר הרבה דברים על ההתנחלויות, הוא עשה איזה עיגול כזה ואמר צריך לקחת כסף מההתנחלויות, והיום הוא לא מדבר בכלל על זה. הוא אמר את זה. והיום הוא לא מדבר בכלל, הוא ככה מגמגם בכל התהליך המדיני, הוא לא ברור בתהליך המדיני, רבותיי. הוא לא ברור בכלל. גם אני חושב שהמפלגה שלו היא לא כל כך מפלגה שהיא הומוגנית. יש שם קצוות של כל מיני אנשים שבאו מכל מיני כיוונים, ולכן אני חושב שברגע מסוים שיהיה תהליך שלום, בקטע הזה הוא כן יתמוך, ואז תהיה לו בעיה עם החברות שלו עם בנט. אז תתחיל ההתפרקות של החבילה הזאת. אבל צריך לדעת שאנחנו אסור לנו בשום שלב, שאנחנו עושים כל תהליך שלא יהיה, לשכוח את המצב החברתי במדינת ישראל. צריך לתת את המחשבה והדגש, כי אם המצב החברתי במדינת ישראל לא יהיה טוב, צפיתי את זה כבר ואמרתי את זה לראש הממשלה בקדנציה הקודמת, שתהיה התפרצות של הציבור. לעומת זה, שימו לב, בנושאים כלכליים, חברתיים, הציבור אומר את שלו, יוצא לרחובות. בנושא השלום הציבור הוא סטטי, הוא מחכה שהמנהיגים יעשו בשבילו את העבודה.
Okay. As to the question about the connection between the socioeconomic issues and the conflict, there's no doubt that these two issues are connected. 20% of the national budget goes to defense, and there's no doubt that this government, in addition, has hit the citizens with even harder laws and policies. Young people today can't buy a home, and even rent is too high. The government made it harder for citizens than it already was. It cut child payments and hurt citizens and large families. Yair Lapid, God granted us with a blessing of a short memory. He is stuttering on issues of security, and it's unclear where he stands. However, in a peace agreement, he will support the agreement, and he'll have to lose his friend Bennett. We must look out for the economic and social issues, because these are the issues that bring the Israeli public out to the streets. They don't rally on issues of security and issues of two states, but these are the issues that they're worried about.
לגבי השאלה של הפליטים מאפריקה. תראו רבותיי, אני אספר לכם דבר שאני חי אותו במציאות. אני ישן 3 ימים בירושלים בבית מלון. בגלל שאני גר רחוק, אני לא הולך ועושה את המסלול הזה כל יום. אני נשאר 3 ימים בירושלים. במלון שאני קבוע נמצא בו, רוב העובדים היו ממזרח ירושלים. רוב עובדי המלון מזרח ירושלים. מאז שהתחילו הפליטים האלו להיכנס, תפסו את המקום של הפלסטינים. ואני חושב שזה טעות. יש כאלו שאומרים, אנחנו כמדינה צריכים לתת מקלט לאותם פליטים, אבל רבותיי, זה בא על חשבון פקעת אחרת שאנחנו בוקעים אצל הציבור שעובד ולא מוצא עבודה. וזו טעות לחשוב שאנחנו יכולים להכניס בלי סוף פליטים, ורבותיי, הייתה תקופה שנכנסו בחודש 20,000 פליטים. אף מדינה לא מסוגלת לקלוט דבר כזה. לא מדינה קטנה כמו מדינת ישראל. ורבותיי, הם גם הלכו למקומות שזה לא בריא, לשכונות חלשות. לשכונות שהם קשה להם גם ככה ביום יום. הם העלו את שכר הדירה, שגם ככה הוא קשה. לכן אני חושב שהמדינה טיפלה נכון בנושא של הפליטים. זה שלפעמים משתמשים במילים יפות. גם השר היום, שהוא שר הפנים, גדעון סער, הוא קשה לו עם החלטת בית המשפט העליון לגבי הנושא של הפליטים. אני לא חושב שצריך לכלוא אותם, אני לא חושב שצריך למצוא פתרון, אבל הפתרון שאנחנו ניתן, שיכנסו אלינו בכמויות כאלו, הדבר הזה לא טוב למדינת ישראל, כיוון שהם לוקחים באיזשהו מקום גם את מקום העבודה של הרבה אזרחים ישראלים, פלסטינים, ערבים ישראלים וגם יהודים. ואני חושב שהדבר הקשה ביותר שאמרו חז"ל, בטלה מביאה לידי חטא, כאשר לוקחים לך את המקום העבודה ואין לך עבודה, זה הפורענות הגדולה ביותר שאדם אין לו מה לעשות, הוא מחפש מה לעשות, ואז לצערנו אנחנו מוצאים את עצמנו במקום אחר.
Okay, I want to tell you that I personally sleep in Jerusalem 3 nights a week. Oh, I'm sorry, this is about the issue of refugees. And he says, I sleep in Jerusalem 3 nights a week because I live far away, and I sleep in a hotel in Jerusalem. And in the past, most of the workers in the hotel came from East Jerusalem. Now,
something dramatic has happened. Okay, because this is what happened with Arik Sharon, because Sharon all of a sudden started using the word occupation. So I think that maybe this is a good litmus test of whether Bibi wants to do something or not. If anybody in the room here hears him sometime in the future use the word occupation, they should know that this is really a major dramatic thing.
Okay, that would be our cue. So we want to close the session this morning. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to give the stage to Ambassador Wilcox to give us closing remarks very shortly, to thank our speakers, and again thank Sarah for translating.
Thanks to the panel, you have given us some very interesting and new insights. Indeed, there's a lot more that meets the eye in Israeli politics. But what I heard was more continuity than change. I did not hear that there is a readiness for the forces of peace, the left in Israel, to mobilize, to provide the incentives, which Dalia said are now not there, to make what are in fact drastic changes in Israeli policy and in the very state of Israel by transforming 45 years of occupation and settlement. You have all placed a heavy burden on Prime Minister Netanyahu, whose past efforts have not revealed a strong commitment for peace and territorial compromise. As he has made more frank and candid remarks about the need for two states, he has accelerated the growth of settlements in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank. So will he rise to this challenge without powerful push from his own public? And if that internal incentive is not going to be there, one can see why the Israeli public shrinks from this challenge, because it means confronting a reality which is very, very difficult, and creating a deep, even deeper division in Israeli society. I'm not so sure that Israelis don't know about the map and the reality in the West Bank. Perhaps they do. But I think there's an instinct, only too human, to say, this is just too difficult. Things are going relatively well. Let's not try to confront this challenge. It was encouraging to hear M.K. Vaknin talk about the pragmatic and peaceful instincts and policies in the Shas party, a major part of Israeli politics and society, which could be a force for change. If indeed there isn't this internal movement in Israel that is going to force the government to make changes in the relatively near future, does that mean that an external incentive is going to be necessary? That has not appeared yet. This group here could be part of that external incentive because I think it does feel the urgency and the need for change. Thank you very much.
Thank you.